Well, I think one of the things that I think has been really important, both at the conference and the work that Border Criminologies has been doing, is sort of developing new notions of belonging. And I think it was Stephen Manning who said at one point that immigrants belong. And I think this is a really important thought. So I think that also for our future work, thinking about new ways of how immigrants do belong, developing new concepts, language of belonging is a really important task. I think much of the sort of the basis for social exclusion of migrants in contemporary society is based on the notion of sort of natural, that their non-belonging is somehow natural, that they are not members. And I think what we need to do in the future is to sort of challenge these notions and develop new concepts of how immigrants do belong.
Do you think, though, I wonder about that idea as well, that if we belong, or immigrants belong, is this that they're going to belong to a place, right? And it still kind of reasserts that there is a place where someone belongs to, where if we, I mean, I think it's a really useful concept as well, but one of my questions was then does that kind of reify the idea of the nation state, or that there's a particular people that will belong somewhere versus a different kind of paradigm or framework of thinking about whether it's inclusion, but I mean, did you have any?
It's a very good question. I think, in a sense, the notions of belonging can be layered. So, but they can both be based on the sort of concepts of shared humanity, sharing a certain social space, which does not need to be a place. At the same time, as we see that much of the exclusions of migrants has been happening despite their attachment to a place. So in a sense, they have been seen as non-belonging, even though they have long-term connections to a certain place. So I think building new notions of belonging both needs to take into account that immigrants do create connections to certain spaces, that they have roots, even though they were not born in a place. At the same time, as also try to think about notions of belonging which sort of transcend the notions of place, time that we are in. We are both examples of people who belong to probably to several places and nations, and I think perhaps it is natural to have some kind of nostalgic tendencies for clarity of categories precisely in these times of great change. At the same time, I think that we do need to stick to sort of to take in the reality of movement, and not only because of displacement, but because of movement which is sort of natural and often encouraged in modern societies.
Right. Now, it seems to be a disjuncture between, I think, the reality of mobility, whether it's climate change or politics or economics, and this retrenchment to these particular forms. Very, very interesting. So let me ask you another follow-up. One thing that came up out of this belonging was that I think from Juliet Stumpf and Stephen Manning's presentation about this focus on the U.S., they highlighted the idea of civil rights and belonging. Right. And then I think you raised the question about the European context. Right. So when we talk about different scales or levels, there's also certain categories or frames of thinking that make sense in particular contexts. Yeah. So if we think about the Nordic context or European context, I mean, this idea about civil rights, I mean, that doesn't mobilize people, I don't think, in the same way as it does in the U.S. or violation of civil rights, for example. What do you think is the frame that might mobilize people in terms of understanding these violations, in terms of border control and in Europe? In Europe, or in the Norway or in the Nordic countries, if you think there's a difference.
Well, I think one of the sort of important aspects is that we should actually stick to the well-established principles of rights, due process, sort of standards that we have for taking liberty away from people and so on, which should be the same for both citizens and non-citizens. So in that way, I think perhaps a form of mobilization would be an insistence. So I think perhaps one strategy would be to insist on the similar standards of rights, due process standards for taking away the liberty of people, regardless of whether they are immigrants or citizens. And I think this should be a sort of platform for mobilization in terms of sort of insisting on the equality, because what we see right now is that in the name of crisis, whether it is migration crisis, refugee crisis, various kinds of national security crisis, due process standards are often sacrificed on the way. And I think an important sort of way of mobilizing would be precisely to insist that this should not be happening regardless of the citizenship status of the people involved. So in a sense, I think both Europe, but also in other countries, one should return to this sort of, the countries should return to their own old ideals of whether it is human rights, which has had perhaps more discursive power in the European context, or civil rights in the US. I think this is very important.
No, I know. One of the things I think that's a bit frustrating, I think, between the gap in the public discourse or political discourse and the academic literature on this is this point that I think in the academic literature we've identified, right, these weaknesses or these pieces of violations of the rule of law and this undermining of the rule of law, and then how this is a threat for democratic societies.
Exactly.
But I think in the public discourse and the political discourse, these kind of exclusions and this use of immigration controls, especially I would say these very violent forms of immigration controls, they're seen as legitimate.
Yes.
And I think as scholars need to make this connection clearer, because I do think these are endangering democratic forms. Yeah. And so making that connection clearer with the public or the political discourse, because we can see them, right, yes. all across Europe.
Yeah. I think you yourself have talked about the brutalization effect that these kinds of coercive border control measures have on the society as a whole. So you cannot simply sort of exercise this level of state power over certain groups without changing the entire society and the principles to which it sort of abides.
Right. No, and I think